he wanted to build a car, as he said, to kick their ass on the street, too. So this is Carroll Shelby's answer to Ferrari. There were rumors it was painted Ferrari red, that was his sort of to Ferrari.
A door that had not been touched in decades finally swung open, and inside sat a machine that history books said could not exist. No paperwork, no production record anyone could agree on, no official announcement from the factory, just a dust-covered shape, low and red, parked like it was waiting for a driver who never came back. The people standing in front of it that day were not looking at just another old Mustang. They were looking at proof that one of the most famous car builders in American history had been hiding a piece of his own story in plain sight. And once word got out about what they had actually found, the entire way people understood Carroll Shelby's career had to be rewritten. To understand why this discovery hit so hard, you have to understand who Carroll Shelby actually was, because the myth and the man were never quite the same thing. He grew up in Texas, and from an early age it was obvious he did not think about machines the way most people did. Cars were not just transportation to him. They were problems waiting to be solved, animals waiting to be tamed, arguments waiting to be won. He raced because it was the only language that made sense to him, and he was good enough at it that people in Europe started paying attention to a loud Texan who refused to drive politely. In 1959, he reached the top of the sport, sharing a win at the 24 Hours of Le Mans behind the wheel of an Aston Martin. It should have been the beginning of a long racing career. Instead, his heart had other plans. A serious heart condition forced him out of the cockpit at almost the exact moment he had proven he belonged there. Most people would have called that the end of the story. Shelby treated it like a redirection. If he could not outdrive the world's best teams anymore, he decided he would outbuild them instead. He took a lightweight British sports car chassis, the AC Ace, and dropped a thunderous American V8 into it. The result was something that had no business existing on paper. It was crude in some ways and brilliant in others, and it terrified the polished European manufacturers who had spent years assuming elegance would always beat brute force. That car became the Shelby Cobra, and it announced to the world that Carroll Shelby's real talent was not driving. It was combination. Take something refined, add something violent, strip away anything unnecessary, and build a machine that made everyone else nervous. That reputation is exactly why Ford came looking for him. In the mid-1960s, Ford's leadership was obsessed with beating Ferrari at Le Mans, and they were willing to spend an enormous amount of money to make it happen. The GT40 program had potential, but potential does not win endurance races. Ford needed someone who understood racing on an instinctual level, someone who could turn an expensive engineering exercise into a weapon. Shelby American took over development, and the payoff was one of the greatest underdog stories in motorsport history. Ford beat Ferrari at Le Mans in 1966, then did it again in 1967, 1968, and 1969. Overnight, Shelby stopped being just a builder of wild sports cars. He became the person American manufacturers called when they needed speed to stop being a slogan and start being real. Around that same time, Ford had another problem it wanted Shelby to solve, and this one was closer to home. The Mustang had become a sales phenomenon, but Lee Iacocca and the rest of Ford's leadership knew that sales numbers alone would not give the car lasting credibility. They needed the Mustang to be taken seriously by people who actually cared about performance, not just style. Shelby's answer arrived in 1965 with the GT350, a car that turned a friendly pony car into something with real teeth. The GT500 followed a couple of years later, pushing that idea even further with more displacement and more attitude. These were not simply dressed-up Mustangs with a badge slapped on the fender. They were declarations that Ford's little economy-adjacent coupe could hang with cars that cost far more. But here's the part of the story that most casual fans never hear about, and it is the part that matters most for what happened decades later. The Mustangs that reached showrooms were never the whole picture. Behind every finished Shelby product sat a graveyard of prototypes, test mules, experimental parts, and half-finished ideas that never made it to the public. In the 1960s, nobody treated these development cars as future treasures. They were tools. Engineers used them to test suspensions, engines, brakes, and styling concepts, and once a car had done its job, it typically met one of three fates. It got sold off quietly with no explanation of its history. It got stripped for parts and left to rot. Or it got sent straight to the crusher, because keeping an experimental vehicle around created legal and logistical headaches nobody wanted to deal with. The engineers building these cars were thinking about deadlines and race results, not about what collectors might pay for them 50 years later. That is the world that produced the car at the center of this story. For decades, insiders and hardcore Mustang historians talked about it the way people talk about a shipwreck everyone has heard of but nobody has actually located. They knew it had existed. They had scattered photographs, second-hand memories from people who worked at Shelby American, and just enough documentation to prove it was not pure fantasy. But the physical car itself had vanished, and the explanation almost everyone accepted was the obvious one. It had gone to the crusher like so many other test vehicles before it. If that were true, there was nothing left to search for. Case closed. Except the most dangerous mistake anyone can make in automotive history is assuming a car is dead just because the paperwork implies it should be. The car in question was a 1967 prototype, and it broke the mold immediately just by its shape. Nearly every Shelby Mustang people picture is a fastback, aggressive and low with that signature sloped roofline. This one was a notchback coupe, a body-style Shelby almost never touched, along with a later 1968 prototype that would eventually become just as legendary. It was one of only 2 notchback coupes to ever wear a Shelby badge. That alone would make it a curiosity worth chasing. But its real significance went deeper than its unusual silhouette. This was not a showroom car. It was a rolling laboratory, built so that Ford and Shelby American could experiment with big block engine packages, supercharging setups, and styling ideas that had not yet been approved for mass production. Some of those styling cues would later influence a special edition Mustang that did make it to dealerships, which meant that even though the original test car disappeared, echoes of it were quietly driving around on public roads without anyone realizing where the inspiration came from. For years, the search for this car went absolutely nowhere, and one big reason was staring everyone in the face without them noticing it. A separate 1968 experimental notchback prototype had survived and ended up in the hands of a serious collector, someone with the resources and the obsession needed to fully restore it and dig into its history. That car was loaded with ideas that felt shockingly advanced for the era, including 4-wheel disc brakes, independent rear suspension, and an early form of electronic fuel injection. It felt less like a leftover from the 1960s and more like something that had been quietly ahead of its time the entire way. While restoring that surviving prototype, the collector and his restoration specialist kept circling back to a nagging question. If one experimental notchback had somehow escaped destruction, was it possible its older sibling from 1967 had escaped too? Most people in the hobby assumed the answer was no. Experts had already tried and failed to track down the missing 1967 car for years. Rumors placed it everywhere and nowhere, crushed, stolen, wrecked, disassembled for parts, or simply lost in a chain of owners who had no idea what they were sitting on. But the restoration specialist working on the surviving 1968 car had a hunch that the trail was not actually cold. It had just never been searched correctly. This is where the story stops sounding like a movie plot about a hidden warehouse and starts sounding like real detective work, which honestly makes it more satisfying. Nobody found this car by stumbling into a secret room lit by dramatic overhead lights. They found it through paperwork, cross-referencing, and a willingness to question an assumption everyone else had accepted as fact. For years, everyone who tried to trace the missing prototype searched using the identification number Shelby American had assigned it. That search kept leading to dead ends because it was, in a sense, the wrong name for the car. Every vehicle built on a Ford assembly line also carried an original factory VIN before it was ever converted into a Shelby, and that number had essentially been buried underneath the Shelby-specific identity everyone was chasing. Once the team shifted their search to the original Ford VIN instead of the Shelby serial number, records that had been sitting untouched for years suddenly became relevant again. Registrations, dealership paperwork, and old ownership history started forming a trail, and that trail pointed toward rural Texas. There is something almost poetic about a Texas-born car builder's most mysterious creation eventually surfacing back in Texas, sitting quietly for decades in the exact kind of overlooked, unglamorous spot where nobody expects automotive history to be hiding. On March 3, 2018, the search team located the car in a rural part of North Texas, and what they found was nothing like the polished museum piece people had pictured in their imaginations for 50 years. This was not a car sitting under a fitted cover in a climate-controlled garage. It was rough. It was weathered. The engine and transmission were missing entirely. Body panels were gone or damaged. It had been sitting outdoors and indoors in various states of neglect among a collection of other old vehicles, The kind of scene that could easily make an untrained eye walk right past it without a second glance. To someone who did not know exactly what they were looking at, it would have looked like just another tired, stripped-down old Mustang shell rusting away on a rural property. To the people who understood the VIN, the body proportions, and the subtle details that separated this car from an ordinary production Mustang, it was nothing short of a holy grail moment. What makes this survival story so remarkable is how accidental the whole thing was. This was not a car that had been carefully preserved by someone who understood its significance. It survived because of a chain of misunderstandings, neglect, and pure luck. It passed through the hands of owners who apparently had little to no idea about the car's real history. It got moved, stored, partially stripped, and essentially forgotten by the wider world while sitting in plain sight the entire time. That is often how the rarest survivors make it through. A famous, well-documented car gets protected because everyone knows what it is worth. An obscure prototype with confusing paperwork and a body style nobody associates with its brand can slip through the cracks precisely because nobody realizes what they are looking at. If the story of its identity had been clearer at any point along the way, there's a real chance someone would have parted it out or scrapped it entirely, thinking it was just another old coupe not worth the trouble of keeping. Verifying that this really was the long-lost prototype took more than a gut feeling. It required serious authentication work, cross-referencing serial numbers, date codes, and confidential factory documents with the help of a nationally recognized Mustang authentication expert. Once that verification was complete, the story shifted from hopeful rumor to confirmed history. This was not simply an old red Mustang that happened to look interesting. This was the lost Shelby GT500 EXP prototype, a vehicle that had essentially been erased from the physical record for half a century, suddenly back and verifiable. It is worth sitting with why a car like this should not have survived in the first place, because that context is what makes the discovery so significant rather than just a nice story about an old car taining up. Prototype vehicles almost never get sentimental treatment from the companies that build them. Once a test car has done its job, there are plenty of practical reasons to make it disappear. Liability concerns, protection of unreleased engineering ideas, and simple corporate housekeeping all push